God, but life is loneliness, despite all the opiates, despite the shrill tinsel gaiety of parties with no purpose, despite the false grinning faces we all wear. And when at last you find someone to whom you can pour out your soul, you stop in shock at the words that you utter. They are so rusty, so ugly, so meaningless and feeble from being kept in the small, cramped dark inside you so long. Yes, there is joy, fulfillment and companionship, but the loneliness of the soul, in its appalling self-consciousness, is horrible and overpowering. Sylvia Plath. How much better is silence, the coffee cup? How much better to sit by myself like the solitary seabird that opens its wings on the stake? Let me sit here forever with all these bare things, this coffee cup, this knife, this fork, things in themselves, myself being myself. Virginia Woolf.
I did write the 10 years time essay. Didn't realise we had to read it out loud, so I got embarrassed.
In 10 years' time, I want to live in a house with big windows. I want the house to be large enough to have a kitchen table with 4 chairs, but not too roomy to ever feel the depths of my aloneness. Because I'll probably be alone. But I think aloneness won't feel so all-consuming with windows that protect me from the world, but still let me watch it.
Welcome back, friends. So, recently, on a whim, after a passing recommendation from a friend and needing something to fill these long quarantined hours, I decided to watch Netflix's Sex Education. And Lord, do I need to talk about it. Originally, back when this show first aired, I wasn't super into the idea of watching it, assuming that I had probably seen most of its content in shows like Skins and Glee. Also, 16 to 18 college in Britain is a truly horrifying time I do not want to have to relive. But I did watch Sex Education, and you know what? It's pretty good. It's not that different from Skins or Glee, but it's far less patronising and dangerous than they are, both shows I was obsessed with as a teenager. Beyond that, Sex Education is inclusive, kind of remarkably so for a British show of its kind. It can be really funny, it has great portrayals of all kinds of friendships, and well, most importantly, transatlantic bicon and overall goddess Gillian Anderson is in it. The characters are pretty sound too, ranking from school shooter awkward to cry-wanking angel, all being portrayed and handled with a level of nuance and care that leaves you relating and enjoying almost all of them, often giving credence and values to storylines not seen on this kind of television show, like the mental health issues of a young black jock with gay parents, to the sexual desires of older-aged women. Sex Education is an ensemble piece where you actually, generally, enjoy the ensemble. However, its representation isn't always perfect, and as a bi person watching the show with too much time on my hands, I feel like I have a few things that might need discussing. The biggest of those things being Maeve. Like, we really need to talk about Maeve. Maeve in class, Maeve in feminism, Maeve as a victim of torture by a writer, and we are definitely going to talk about how Maeve is bloody bisexual. Hello, my name is Mage, and welcome to Black and White Thinking. Now, before I briefly discuss bisexuality as a whole within Sex Education and any issues I may have with said representation, I will say that the bisexual representation that the show does provide us with isn't terrible. The bar for what can be considered good bisexual representation on television these days is pretty low, but Sex Education tries, considering what it is comparable to. The show really is quite Glee. Sex Education attempts to make some progress through characters like Adam and Ola, and they have actually used the word bisexual, so props for that. Personally, I wasn't a huge fan of how they are portraying the pan versus bi thing, and would love it if this show would go one step further, unlike literally every other show, and could address the fact that there is no difference between the two labels, that pansexuality exists underneath the bi plus umbrella, and not lead towards a portrayal of woke, cute pansexuality and raging awful bisexual. I mean, this show very much has an unknowing habit of portraying bisexuality as something fearful and a little bit monstrous, and pansexuality as something almost quirky. Otherwise, Adam and Ola's friendship is truly a gift, and getting to see two bi plus characters interact in this way feels really special at times. And honestly, this awkward portrayal of bisexuality wouldn't feel so evident if Adam wasn't presented as the most violent bully in the show, and the only character has used the word bisexual to identify himself. There are big character differences, of course, context is not lost on me, but there is just a big vibe difference in how these two words are used and discussed within this show.
I'm a pansexual, apparently.
What, like fucking pots and pans? I knew a guy who used to like to stick his dick in the suction pipe of a vacuum cleaner. It's normal.
Pansexual means that you're attracted to the person, not the sex or gender. It's about the connection you have with a human being, not with their genitalia.
You bullied me for years, Adam. You made me feel unsafe for years. You were one of the main reasons I wasn't kind to myself. And I'm supposed to believe that you suddenly changed. You're full of shame, man, and I can't be in that place anymore. I've had to work really hard to love myself, and I won't go back to hiding things about me again.
I'm scared. And I think I'm bisexual.
Sex Education also has a larger number of gay and lesbian identified characters than it does bi+ characters, of which we have 3 or arguably 4. The number of bisexuals is far higher than the 0 trans characters on this show though, so I will consider that a win. Apologies to my trans friends, hopefully the show works to rectify this. Another video for another time perhaps. Anyway, here are all the arguably gay and lesbian identified characters that we see on screen. Now, not all of these characters have self-ID'd as gay or lesbian aloud, but the show has definitely portrayed them in such a way. It is also the bi+ characters of Sex Education, opposed to their lesbian and gay counterparts, who seem to be either more confused or uncertain in their queerness, or simply unaware of said queerness, in a way that their monosexual counterparts are not. A lot of this can feel very run-of-the-mill bisexual representation in teen television to me. I think a lot of mistakes that are made are accidental, and there aren't that many mistakes. There is simply room for a lot of improvement. Adam is one of my favourite characters on the show, if not maybe of all time, and I really like Ola and Lily separately and as a couple. They are all fully fleshed characters with feelings and motives, and most importantly heart. Adam's redemption does feel particularly fresh because he identifies as bi and not gay. This show is not bad in what it tries to achieve with bisexual rep, in what it does choose to acknowledge. It perhaps makes its biggest mistakes with what it refuses to. This show did not leave me feeling great by the time I had caught up with the currently aired first 2 seasons, and that is entirely to do with how the writers chose to write, treat, and honestly torture Maeve Wiley throughout the entire show. Maeve feels distinctively different from every other character on the show. I feel distinctively different about Maeve than any other character on the show. Maeve's portrayal feels kind of upsetting in comparison to the things I mentioned above, and a lot of this has to do with the fact that Maeve is bi-coded. It's also just super straight up classist and misogynist, and Maeve Wiley deserves better. So let's do this. Queer coding. What is it? A quick rundown. To be queer-coded is to be a character whose traits, mannerisms, aesthetics, etc. can be read as, queer. Historically, this idea has a lot less to do with queerphobia than perhaps initially assumed, and more to do with the restrictions put on creators when it comes to things like the Hollywood Hays Code in the US, to England's tabloids encouraging homophobic censorship laws to be passed because won't somebody please think of the children. If you're interested in knowing more about the history of queer portrayals in films, I would suggest checking out this video, or this book, or this book, or this book, or this one, or this documentary. There are a lot fewer resources for bi film history than there seems to be for gay, lesbian, and trans history, but read that book. In a lot of modern-ish media, queer coding is often distributed in the form of on-the-nose Disney villains, or the more up-to-date Disney anti-hero. They even have Marvel versions. Disney, of course, is not the only culprit of such coding within its stories. There are plenty of other examples from other parts of the media spectrum too. Disney's just an easy target. Characters who are not written explicitly as bisexual, trans, lesbian, or gay, but could be interpreted that way by the audience. Being written this way, perhaps because of historical context, perhaps because some writers are worthless hacks. Queer coding also walks hand in hand with queer baiting, which is essentially a much less neutral descriptor of essentially the same process, sometimes zooming in on the queer coding of a specific LGBT relationship. Queer baiting also implies intention, and a bad one at that, selling your queer audience things that you will knowingly never deliver on. Again, if you want to know more, check out the links in the description to the things that will explain it. So in regards to Maeve Wiley and the general content of this coming video, I want to hone in on a specific type of queer coding, bi-coding. If that's not a phrase already, it is now, it should be a phrase, and it is also definitely a thing that is prevalent in the media, specifically in television, like Riker, bi, Kate Austen, bi, Joker, bi, Emma Swan, bi, Rosa so obviously before she came out that they had to just let her come out, bi. Why are these characters bi-coded? Because I said so? But no, really. Spotting bi-coded characters is as much down to textual interpretation and reading the clues as it is with recognising any kind of queer coding. When it comes to Maeve and the bi-codedness of her character, I think she probably belongs to a very specific trope of bi-coded teen female characters. This class minority goth vixen, the slightly crazy outsider, the Ali Sheedys of the world, the Firuza Balks in The Craft, the Janice Ians, the Quinfa Brays, that invisible girl who reads too many books, the perpetual loner who is rejected by all sides. As a gay narrative may be found by people in representations of lesbian and gay coded characters, so too can a reflection of bisexuality be found in others, sometimes even the same character. Matter of opinion often comes into play here, and mine of course too will. However, please bear in mind I am actually a lower class English bisexual woman with a nose piercing and a bad attitude, so there is definitely some lived experience behind my views on Maeve here too, if that buys me any credibility on this subject. In Maeve's case, in sex education, I would argue we are kind of past the point though of my opinion is that Maeve could be bi-coded, and have moved on to Maeve's narrative directly reflects a very specific bisexual narrative, one that revolves around the weight put on young bisexual people of a particular social class, and how real life problems can often mean that self-exploration is a luxury. My only conundrum really lies in whether or not the show writers are aware of the story they're telling. I think they are. And I think they are based on how, I hate to use the word, woke they are in the rest of their writing. I mean, we are only 2 seasons into sex education. I worry it can be too early to say, but I feel like the writers have said enough via the camera, via their own scripts, to blatantly portray Maeve as bisexual, and by extension Amy. And Netflix is definitely not helping when it does things like promote the show with queerbaity videos like this. In my opinion, there are many ways the show has chosen to convey Maeve's bisexuality, as well as ways that I think Maeve can be read as a bisexual character through metaphor, and not all of these revolve around the fact that she is a teenage caravan park Harley Quinn. So let's start with what I think is the most obvious way to understand Maeve as bisexual, in how she connects and contrasts and parallels purposely with Adam, a character whose entire arc ends up revolving around him understanding and accepting his worth as a bisexual man. The only character on the show who has used the word bisexual to describe and identify themselves so far. Off the bat, it's easy to see parallels between the two characters, the perpetually untethered, the wanton and willful, the dark to the two main characters' light. But I also think they relate in a way that indicates that the writers do probably understand Maeve's framing as queer. I just don't necessarily think that they have the plans to follow through with it on the show itself. It's in our first episode of the show, when Sex Education introduces us to our ensemble of characters via Otis, Eric, and a Donnie Darko style montage, where we first meet Maeve and Adam. Now, this first episode focuses fairly heavily on both Maeve and Adam, and more specifically how they interact with Otis and Eric, indicating their roles as love interests later on. One of the first connections between Maeve and Adam we see, and one I think highlights their status as queer outsiders, is when we see how the other characters in the show, the other students, talk about them. Maeve and Adam are both consistently sexualized, and honestly sexually harassed, by the rest of the student body. Both Maeve and Adam are both essentially seen as whores, their worth existing in their bodies.
And her she sucked off 12 guys in 10 minutes for a day.
It's definitely not true.
What a slag.
Look at that greasy hair. Maybe she can't afford shampoo.
Or deodorant.
Told you. She's basically an info. Oh. Do you reckon his brain is so small because his dick is so big?
That's a myth.
No, it's not. A friend of a friend saw it once. She said it was the size of 2 Coke cans, one on top of the other, length and width.
Now obviously at this point in the story, neither Maeve or Adam are being harassed like this specifically because they are bi. None of the characters hold this information. However, I do think that it is an interesting choice on behalf of the writers to choose Maeve and Adam to be the characters that face this. The over-sexualization of bisexual people in the media, and in the real world, is not some secret knowledge that the writers are not aware of. The statistics show that bisexual people are at risk of high levels of this kind of harassment. The writers know this because they write the cool kids sex show, and the writers also definitely understand the bisexuals fuck everything trope because they go on to reference it in regards to Adam in later season 2. So yeah, it's interesting.
Well, I know that I'm bisexual, but I don't like you like that.
Maeve and Adam's stories overlap and intersect in many ways, and in the first episode we see this not only via Otis and Eric, but also Amy, who is having a secret, or disapproved of by her clique, relationship with them both. And it's through Amy the most we learn of Adam and Maeve's softer sides, a side that the both of them seem to only show with Amy at this point. Again, interesting. To make this all a little easier, I just made a handy list of some of the parallels I could come up with off the top of my head. 1. Their over-sexualization and harassment by other characters. 2. Otis and Eric. They are the main characters' love interests. 3. They are both deeply struggling and their problems are ignored. 4. Their connection through academics, their swapped narratives and relationships with their English teacher. Bumping off number 4, number 5 is the use of bisexual poetry to connect them. 6, their relationship with Ola, who later comes out to identify as Pan. 7, they are both forced out of school at the end of season 1. 8, they are both inherently invisible, which is the biggest peak by mood. I think one of the most interesting ways, in my opinion, that Maeve's storyline meets Adam is via their academics. A storyline that begins in the first episode and continues through the rest of the season 1 is the one surrounding how Maeve is academically gifted but is assumed otherwise because she is poor, and Adam is struggling but no one notices because Maeve is writing his essays for money, and he is also the principal's son. Now obviously, they interact via the act of Maeve writing Adam's essays. Within this arc, we see their English teacher come to an understanding that Maeve has written Adam's essays when he is made to read said essay out in assembly and he messes up the opening. A quote from Langston Hughes' Dreams, one of the arguably most recognisable queer poems by a very queer, most likely bi, poet out of the Harlem Renaissance.
Langston Hughes wrote a poem called Dreams. He said, "Hold fast to dreams, for if dreams die, life is but a broken wingbird that cannot fly." Joseph Conrad. Joseph Conrad was right. We live as we dream. Alone. In 10 years...
This scene is true bisexual solidarity, and it points out two things to me. 1, Maeve finds comfort in queer literature, bisexual women literature. Straight girls do not enjoy the bell jar that much, they just don't. The bell jar is not a heterosexual book. Sylvia Plath herself was bisexual, so is Virginia Woolf. The second thing it shows me is that Maeve and Adam are united in their loneliness, in their outsiderness, in their voted most likely to kill themselves-ness, I guess. And this reference to the heart of darkness that Maeve leaves in Adam's essay only solidifies this further, in my opinion. That the thematic presence of queer loneliness has been relevant and protruding in these kind of stories for a long time. And in real life, this type of queer solitude has real consequences for bisexual people, especially women. The connections between Adam and Maeve become overwhelming when you watch this show in full. And of course, there could be plenty of reasons for this. On-screen storytelling is a nuanced medium. However, when you add this integral part of Maeve's character with other elements of her that can be read as coded, I personally find it very hard to see Maeve as anything other than bi. Adam's entire storyline is about bisexual acceptance and redemption, about understanding your place in a monosexual world, and this parallels completely with Maeve. Maeve, who is unsatisfied in any of her relationships with boys right now, and who only finds real comfort in Amy. Maeve, who remains alone and untethered by the end of season 2, whereas Adam, and also Ola, identified and seen, end season 2 far happier. I'm going to talk about this more later, but I think it's worth understanding, and not only in regards to Maeve, that coming out and having the ability to identify public is a privilege, and a privilege that is statistically awarded to bisexual people less than their lesbian and gay peers. And whilst one could argue that that's because bi people are less likely to come out or have same-sex relationships, and therefore they should be less represented in these stories, this just ignores biphobia completely. Sex education itself has so many more gays and lesbians than bisexual ones, even though there are more bisexual people in the LGBT community than LG or T. Again, this point really does not consider inherent biphobia, or how this biphobia is accepted and written into the foundations of LGBT media, that even though bisexual people make up the largest part of the LGBT community, that we feel underrepresented, because we are, which leads to us staying closeted, which leads to straight and gay writers excluding us from their stories, just as they have excluded us from society's narrative. The history of bisexuality and the lived bisexual experience cannot be separated from erasure and invisibility. We see this in Adam, and this is also why Maeve is such a great representation for this in media right now.
Let's get you home. Want to walk me home?
As I touched on just a moment ago, Maeve and Amy have quite the friendship. A friendship that is quite often compared to the relationship that Amy has with the closeted bisexual Adam at the beginning of the show. Maeve and Amy are perhaps more in love than any duo on this show, romantically or otherwise. Like, let's take a real hard look with our eyes at how Maeve and Amy act with each other in comparison to the way they interact with whatever boy they are paired with at the time, because it is truly beyond subtextual at this point. Roll the tape.
To be honest, I'm team Maeve and Amy.
One of my favourite parts of the entire Maeve-Amy dynamic in season 1 is that Amy dumps Adam because he is lowering her reputation and her friends tell him to, but she later dumps the popular kids who tell her this for Maeve anyway, using the exact romantically tinged language she used with Adam.
I broke up with Adam.
What the hell are you doing?
I'm dumping you. For her.
Maeve and Amy's relationship only grows stronger over the show, as their relationship with the boys they are trying to date grows more complicated. They understand each other in a way that neither of them are receiving from their partner. This is not just a case of straight friends with boyfriends. These two seem to understand each other in a way that they cannot find in a partner. This is absolutely a consequence of compare, and more proof that compare affects all women. Maeve and Amy love each other so much that they do not ever once consider that they could be queer. I find it hard to believe this is simply because they are heterosexual and not because they don't know they are actually allowed to. Amy is quite honestly one of the biggest sufferers of compare on the show. A very specific type of I fuck boys because that's what good girls do, men actually terrify me compare. She is a much more Hollywood version of the hentai Lily. And Maeve just likes any boy that is nice to her because everyone in her life treats her like shit. Maeve likes boys that are safe, Amy likes boys that are aesthetically pleasing. They are both very bi. Like, I'm not sure if I'm making a point that everyone else knows, but Amy's boyfriends, specifically Adam and then Steve, are both just versions of Maeve. I feel like I've covered similarities between Maeve and Adam, but look at them existing between Steve and Maeve too. Look at how Amy treats them. Like how in this scene, Amy bringing one cake to Steve is a sign that she likes him, but Amy making an entire batch of cakes for Maeve, and not for the first time in the show either, is a sign of women empowering women, I guess. And then there is this scene, which is basically just Amy being cute and Maeve and Steve loving every second of it. This whole scene is bisexual as hell from the Maeve, Amy, Steve angle, but it only increasingly becomes more bisexual when you understand that Maeve is giving dagger sex eyes to Ola throughout this conversation. Ola, who is sat with her future girlfriend Lily, and then the camera cuts to Adam at homo camp. Honestly, this entire episode, the second of the second season, is one of the most bisexual episodes of television I've ever bloody seen. Maeve and Ola taking their girlfriends on a date to the fair. They fight over a boy neither of them actually wants, whilst he spends time with his gay best friend. And Adam has this whole thing going on. This whole episode, in my opinion, signifies so much of Maeve's queerness. Not only do we see her have these kind of interactions with Amy, and then these ridiculous parallels with Ola and Lily, two characters who end up dating not long after this, a scene that should really make us think about how Amy and Maeve's relationship is being portrayed in relation to other queer relationships on this show. But we also have this scene, one of the most painful scenes on TV I might have ever watched, honestly.
I did write the 10 years time essay. Didn't realise we had to read it out loud, so I got embarrassed.
In 10 years' time, I want to live in a house with big windows. I want the house to be large enough to have a kitchen table with 4 chairs, but not too roomy to ever feel the depths of my aloneness. Because I'll probably be alone. But I think aloneness won't feel so all-consuming with windows that protect me from the world, but still let me watch it.
I'm sorry. Sorry.
I don't think I belong in the class. You're a beautiful writer, Maeve. You can have more expansive dreams than 4 chairs and some windows. Think about it.
Maeve is out here writing a goddamn modern sequel to The Well of Loneliness, and the writers still don't want to talk about the fact she is bi. And well, that leads me to my next point. Now, I don't want to spend hours explaining how cognitive dissonance in character portrayal is something bisexual characters suffer from at an increased rate, even though it is both true and important. But I do want to talk about how the cognitive dissonance around Maeve Wiley, specifically, and how it reads as, let's say, icky, and how this misshapen existence of Maeve's renders her experiences invisible in relation to the explicitly queer characters of the show. How Maeve's experience has been silenced in order for her to serve the purpose of fulfilling Otis's wet fucking dreams. Like, being honest, this is really where my issue with Maeve begins. And I really wouldn't be discussing the issues I had with Maeve if I didn't think this was a potentially damaging portrayal of not only a bi-coded character, but also a poor white girl with no support system, relying on Lip Gallagher-style scams, charity, and the terrible and murderous British benefit system. A benefit system that the show has yet to acknowledge, but Maeve is 100% reliant on, given the information we have for her character. Honestly, I don't know if anyone involved in writing this show has any real experience with the kind of poverty they write about Maeve suffering from. And this is one of those weird clues, along with the private caravan landlord public housing situation, that makes me think this. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I have my own relationship with the wonders of British poverty, and I notice these things. Some of this stuff can feel a little Jeremy Kyle, you know? Now, Maeve, as a character, is divided. And although this isn't all inherently involved with her potential bisexuality, it is also not entirely separate. Maeve is pulled between two polarising positions and never allowed to exist in her own space, or to be both, or all, or some of the things that others around her are allowed to be. This in itself could be read quite easily as a metaphor for the bi-existence in a mono world. Maeve is fantastical and romantic, as well as gritty and real, yet neither simultaneously. To the writer's credit, this too could be read as a look at how Maeve's real life exists with her mirror self, and how this is a reflection of girls like Maeve in the real world, but that would require Maeve to actually have a character arc and some personal autonomy, which this show just really doesn't give her. That's what is so damn annoying about sex education. It's so close to doing the big things, to saying real things about society, but it struggles to balance its pseudo-egalitarian high school aesthetic with its actual drama. Much like Skins and much like Glee, Maeve, above all, suffers the consequences of this. Now, this show is mostly written by two women and suffers a lot less misogyny, like I said, because of it, in relation to those other two shows. However, it's not exempt from sexism, and I'm definitely sure Laura Mulvey would have a field day discussing the fact this show is entirely directed by men but written by women. A lot of male side characters in this show are given far more growth and peace than Maeve, the female lead. Characters who are minorities too, like Jackson and Adam, and the male characters like Otis, who just aren't really. Unless the writers want to talk about autistic coding, but I'm not going to go there right now. Maeve seems to exist within the liminal space within the show, in this middling where she ends up with no real character arc, or at least no major growth, between the beginning of season 1 and the end of season 2. She is still unseen and miserable. She still undervalues herself. She is still faced with the tough decisions other characters aren't. She is also used quite consistently as a tool in other people's storylines, and this stagnates her. The only real progress Maeve seems to make in 2 seasons is apparently she likes Otis now. When you combine this muffled take on duality, the use of Maeve as plot fodder, and her polarisation between broken outsider and sexy babe with her bi-coded characteristics and potentially queer-baiting relationship with Amy, I feel like there is a risk of crossing over into biphobic territory. It's just Quinn Fabray all over again, but worse this time. As I, and like real-life actual queer theorists have said, a writer choosing not to identify a character as LGBT does not mean a character is not LGBT, even in this post-code era. We all know Maeve is going to be kissing girls in university, if she gets there, regardless of how she ends the show, right? With regards to bisexuality in particular, the invisible sexuality, a sexuality that has historically faced erasure unlike any other, sometimes the only place our stories exists is in the hidden, in both real life and in media and in literature. Oppression has unfortunately made it so. Which brings me to another point I think may be worth mentioning here in regards to Maeve. One of the things I've seen discussed by queer theorists over the years is that there is a risk of us accepting our alienation when we look for queer coding. This idea that a queer audience can risk painting their own stories into the shadows when they focus on unidentified queer characters, instead of the ones who have been labelled queer by their writers. This point could hold in some cases, and I don't think it would be hard for someone to try and argue that here, that I am personally ungrateful for what we do have in regards to bi plus rep in the show, with characters like Adam and Ola, and I am looking for a shadow Maeve because perhaps she better fits what I want to see from these kinds of stories. However, this would be misplaced in my opinion, and I think this critique is much better used in regards to how the writers have handled Maeve's portrayal. Context matters when trying to understand portrayals like this, in my opinion. Firstly, there are not enough bisexual people in this show. Not for the type of show this is, and not when there are more people in the LGBT community who ID as bi than there are any of the other identities. Please just let us have Maeve. Secondly, at the cost of repeating myself, unfortunately there really is no separation of bisexuality from invisibility at this point. Queerness and erasure walk hand in hand generally, but the main thing is this: I do not think I am searching the shadows for anything that the writers have not placed there, and I really just don't love that for bisexual representation, or for Maeve and the type of very specific real woman she represents. I mean, Maeve's bisexuality is literally everywhere, in her love of literature, in the way everyone perpetually ignores her, segregates and sexualizes her, in her parallels with Adam, in her Sylvia Plath effect aesthetic, in every time she looks at Amy, in every moment she is alone, and definitely every time she is dressed like this and acts like this.
How'd you know as a girl?
I read a lot of true crime.
Which brings me to, why Maeve? The representations of white trash in new queer cinema explicitly acknowledge how white trash identity is a rather queer thing. Queer lends itself to white trash, and vice versa, because both categories decenter and destabilise, promoting constant flux. Queer's conceptual ability to move or pass across things is comparable to the anchorlessness of many new queer characters. They keep moving across the landscape, forever passing through and between places, identities and things. Daniel Moody Cunningham. So as I said before, and again I'm repeating myself, I don't think the writers are blind to the kind of special bisexual/class trauma they inflict on Maeve Wiley. They are well enough aware of the nuances of teen sexuality to have this pretty solid scene on asexuality. I mean, they know who Langston Hughes is, right? They probably know who Angela Davis is. This is pro-queer, pro-feminist, inclusive storytelling, right? The writers definitely understand that class, race, sexuality and gender all matter. I mean, it's not a coincidence that Eric and Maeve have the poorhouses. It is because of the hand they were dealt in life. The writers understand how to reflect social nuance in good ways, which is why Maeve's torture and stagnation feels so rough to me. Maeve's storyline doesn't reek of misogyny or classism or biphobia in a harsh, vengeful manner. It is stained by all of these things combined in a weirdly passive way, especially in relation to all other narratives and arcs on this show, as if the show's world exists within the parameters of a John Hughes movie, but Maeve's home life is directed by Ken Loach. So again, why Maeve? Perhaps Maeve is too much, the girl of many multitudes, too queer to be an acceptable example of queerness, a punishment truly befit for the most outspoken of young ladies, especially those with such lowly backgrounds and shameless proclivities. This has so much more to do with class than I think can be initially obvious. Maeve is the poorest, so she will suffer the most. However, instead of exploring what this could mean to Maeve, the writers are too distracted by using her as a prize for Otis to focus on this. So we end up with aesthetic poverty, invisible poverty, which is essentially what they are doing with Maeve's sexuality too. When you write one character to represent an entire demographic, they will always suffer within the narrative, and as a character. If this wasn't also about class, I could probably write a lot of this about Amy instead. If this wasn't about class, Fiona Gallagher wouldn't be Maeve's literal mother. And the silencing of Maeve's evolution is hard to watch at this point. Like, yes, as I said, bisexual people are more likely to be closeted than their gay and lesbian counterparts. Biphobia and monosexism have made it this way. We don't just enjoy the warmth of the closet. And yes, arguably, Maeve could represent this within sex education. However, she shouldn't. It's just torture porn at this point. Torture porn aimed at a very small demographic of poor queer women. And it's just kind of nasty. Like, make Otis's life hell instead. Fuck. Make Adam's life hell. I love Adam, but he spends the first season beating up a black gay kid, and Maeve spends the first season having an abortion, being literally tamed like the shrew she is, and being thrown out of school for something her brother does. This kind of story also doesn't really allow for the nuances of lower class bisexual silence, unless Maeve herself is acknowledged as bisexual, as suffering for her queerness, and her lower class, and her position as an outspoken feminist and woman. I mean, bisexual and trans people are statistically more likely to actually live in poverty than those people that are gay or straight. Monosexism and the patriarchy have a very historic connection. As I've said, the aesthetic is all there, but the understanding of Maeve's lack of privilege isn't. Like, Maeve herself has to acknowledge her lower class status in her home life because it is her lived experience, but she attempts to hide it otherwise. And when she does tell someone she is poor, like really actually poor, she spends her time trying not to inflict that poorness on the well-off friends she has. The characters in this show, or the writers who created it, consistently act like Maeve has the privilege of free time and energy and space like her peers. Otis is worried about whether or not to be sexist to his mother and if he can wank. Maeve is worried about whether or not to skip an academic opportunity so she can call social services and inform them that her mother has relapsed. Season 2 ends for Adam like this, for Ola and Lily like this, and for Maeve like this. All these characters have been bi+ coded and had eventual arcs revolving around said fact. Maeve is denied that. Repeating myself again, but yes, this is not all to do with the fact that writers don't want to admit to Maeve's obvious bisexuality. But it's not related. The ability to personally identify is a privilege, one often stolen from bisexuals. For Maeve, and so many real girls like her, she has way too much shit to focus on to deal with her own feelings. She devalues herself because she is too busy taking care of others. Maeve is considered worthless, and though the characters and writers may both argue otherwise, no one takes on the realities of Maeve's existence but Maeve. Boys don't get Maeve, girls don't get Maeve, straight people don't get Maeve, gay people don't get Maeve. After 2 seasons, Maeve is still alone, her experiences invisible, which is both metaphorical and the real lived haunting of a lot of bisexual people, regardless of gender, race or class. At the end of the day, this video is not really an advocation for anything in particular, more than it is a ramble of my own thoughts on this show and how it tends to portray certain elements of a queer poor reality. I do hope, however, that the writers offer Maeve some release. I hope that they consider that there can be power in saying the thing, that there is empirical proof that it is damaging to not say the thing. Bisexuality in all forms deserves presence. Bisexuals, much like demons, find power in their naming. A word that has been rendered dirty at best and non-existent at worst deserves to be reclaimed, especially when there are so many bisexuals out there just existing. That is where I believe the difference can be made, because Maeve is very bisexual either way. Right now, she's just bisexual and invisible.